Hello again, everyone. So in the last lecture, we discussed Socrates' motivations, primarily his motivation stemming from the relativism of the sophists. The idea being, roughly, that there are so many issues with relativism that relativism just seems clearly false. But also, Socrates had extra motivation for wanting to prove that relativism was false. He wanted to undermine the sophists and their relativism because he believed that we could only live the best life if we take proper care of our soul. We're going to have to discuss that in a lot more detail later. But since the sophists were teaching a falsehood, right? If relativism is false and the sophists are teaching this falsehood, then this is damaging to the souls of everybody who buys from them. Remember, they were selling education, right? So it's damaging the souls of everybody who buys this education from them, because essentially we're feeding our souls bad information about the good, the just, and what's true. And so not only is relativism seemingly false, it's at least super unintuitive, as we saw in the last lecture, but also, being that it's very likely false, and being that it teaches people that the good and the just are just relative to what you personally believe, right? It's corrupting their souls, according to Socrates. And so there's two main reasons to want to get rid of it, right? Because we care about the truth, and because we care about living a good life where our souls are taken care of. Okay, so that's what's motivating Socrates here. He wants to undermine this relativism. But what's the overall goal, right? So in order to undermine this relativism, Socrates is going to need to find these objective truths. And so Socrates, throughout these dialogues, his overall goal is to find objective truth, but objective truth particularly about the virtues. And he's going to do this by taking a very particular approach, right? He's going to search for it in a very particular way. He's going to search for objective truth by trying to find the correct definition or the correct meaning of the virtues. So throughout these dialogues, for example, he's going to ask, what is piety? What is justice? What is virtue? What is courage? What is wisdom? So on and so forth. And he thinks by finding a definition for each of these words, at a definition that's not open to objection, that he's going to gain objective knowledge. And once he gets that, he can undermine the work of the sophists, and then he can help elucidate how we can live the good life. Okay, so that's a lot all in one. Don't worry, we're going to unpack this as we go. But the first question we should ask ourselves, right, is, well, how are we going to find these correct definitions, right? There are maybe an infinite number of possible different definitions we could give for each of these words. How are we going to find the correct one? Luckily, Socrates gives us his process in the Euthyphro. So the Euthyphro is a perfect example of how Socrates believes this process works for finding the definition of the different virtues. And so roughly what Socrates does is he finds people who profess to have expertise. So there are a number of well-to-do, powerful people in Athens who claim to know a lot about justice and piety and wisdom, so on and so forth. Right? So he seeks these people out because if anybody knows what these terms are, it must be these people who claim to be experts. And once he meets up with them, he starts to question them about it. He tries to absorb their knowledge, or at least question them about it, to see if they really have the type of expertise they claim they have. So he asks them to define the term, and then they inspect those definitions that people give. And so the rough idea here would be you're not just starting from scratch, right? You're starting from people who already who already claim to have expertise about these different things, right? So that at least moves you a little bit further ahead in the process of looking through all the possible definitions of a word, right? Okay, so let's get into the Euthyphro to see how this process works and sort of in real time, right? So in the Euthyphro, here's the rough setup, right? Socrates and Euthyphro bump into each other outside of the courthouse. Socrates is there because he's being charged. He has to respond to charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens, and so he's here on those charges. But Euthyphro is there charging his own father with impiety. Roughly what's happened for Euthyphro to charge his father like this is his father ended up killing a slave. So one of Euthyphro's father's slaves killed another, and Euthyphro's father tied up the murderer and threw him in a pit, essentially, to wait for someone to go into the city and come back with information about what he's supposed to do with the murderer. And while somebody was running back and forth to get this information, the father was basically neglected. The father neglected the slave who he left in the pit, and the slave died from exposure and starvation, so on and so forth. And so Euthyphro thinks what his father has done is impious, right? He let somebody die, and his father didn't have the authority to sort of sentence this person to death, so his father has done something impious. And so that's why Euthyphro's there. Now, Socrates hears this, and he's sort of flabbergasted. He says, wow, Euthyphro, you must really know a lot about piety. Why is that so? Well, I mean, this still stands even today, but particularly in ancient Athens, right? It was seen as impious itself to bring charges against one's family members, right? So even today, it's taboo for you to sort of attack your family in this way, right? So if your family members are doing something improper, it's taboo to snitch on them or turn them into the police or rat them out, right? And so the idea is roughly the same here. In ancient Athens, it's impious to bring these charges against your family members. And so Socrates is claiming Euthyphro must really have expertise if he's willing to do this extremely taboo thing. Only somebody who truly understood piety would be willing to go against the norm and bring their own father up on charges of impiety. And Euthyphro says, yeah, you're right, Socrates. I really do have knowledge about piety. And so Socrates says, well, great. That's fantastic news for me. I don't know about piety. I don't know what the correct meaning or definition of piety is. And I'm being charged with piety myself. So please, Euthyphro, give me your knowledge so that I can better defend myself in court. And Euthyphro obliges. So Euthyphro is going to share his wisdom, and Socrates says, okay, well, let's get started. Please define piety for me. And so definition 1, Euthyphro says, I say that the pious is to do what I am doing now, to prosecute the wrongdoer, be it about murder or temple robbery or anything else, whether the wrongdoer is your father or mother or anyone else, and not to prosecute is impious. So after I read each of these definitions, I recommend you pause and think about what might be wrong with them. But if not, let's go ahead and move on. So what does Socrates think is wrong with this definition? Because basically what Euthyphro is saying here is, look, just do what I'm doing now, right? If you want to be pious, you just need to prosecute the wrong. I'm a perfect example of what it means to be pious. And Socrates says, okay, well, that's not even really a definition. That doesn't help me at all, right? Socrates wants the form itself that makes all pious actions pious. In other words, what Euthyphro has given Socrates is not a definition. It's merely an example of a pious action. Socrates doesn't want just an example. He wants to understand the very essence of piety. He wants to understand what it means to be pious in all of the different ways one can be pious. He doesn't just want this one example. Another way of saying this is he wants a general definition, right? He wants to be able to take the definition of piety that he's given and then look out at everything in the world and determine whether or not it's pious based on this definition. what Euthyphro has given him here, well, he can't do it with that, right? He can just look at examples of prosecuting the wrong and then say, okay, pious or impious. But realistically, there are many other actions that piety and impiety apply to besides just prosecuting the wrongdoer. So Socrates says, okay, well, you didn't even give me a definition, so we're off to a bad start, right? I need you to give me the essence of piety. I need you to give me a general definition. And so Euthyphro says, okay, yeah, I am really an expert. Let's take another stab at this. And his second definition goes as follows. Well then, what is dear to the gods is pious. What is not is impious. So in other words, piety is that which the gods love. So an action is pious if the gods love it. And an action is impious if the gods don't love it. And here Socrates says, no, that's still not good. If this were true, the same things would be both pious and impious. And so let's think about that. Why might that be? Well, remember, in ancient Greece, we're dealing with a pantheon of gods, right? It's not sort of the Christian conception we deal with now. Right? In the Greek conception, there are a number of gods, and these gods fight amongst themselves. In other words, they have differing beliefs about the world. Right? So the Greek gods are sort of famous for their bickering. The Greek gods are sort of anthropomorphized. They are more human-like. They can be greedy. They can be vengeful. They fight with one another all the time, so on and so forth, right? And so Socrates is essentially saying, look, if these are the gods we're dealing with, right, this is going to lead us to a contradiction. The gods are going to disagree about what they love and what they hate. And so this is going to lead us into a predicament where we look at an action, we ask whether it's loved or hated by the gods. Some gods love it, some gods hate it. Well, that would mean that that action is both pious and impious at the same time. But that's clearly impossible, right? The same thing can't be both pious and impious. That's a contradiction. Another way of putting this is, so say, here's probably not a good example, but let's just go with it. Sacrificing a goat, right? Zeus could say, sacrificing a goat, I love it. Ares could say, sacrificing a goat, I hate it. And that would mean sacrificing a goat is both pious and impious at the same time. That's a contradiction. So the definition, let's not go on yet. The definition here that Euthyphro is given, that piety is just what's dear to the gods, it's a bad definition. Your definition should not lead you into contradictions. Okay, so we'll stop the video here and then move on to definitions 3 and 4 in the next one. Thank you, everyone.